So let me welcome you to Harvard Global Equity Initiative's Alternate Home with Dr. Homi Bhabha and the Humanities Center, Mahindra Humanities Center. We're incredibly pleased to be here again, and we're incredibly pleased that we have a baby with us as well. Please feel very comfortable to have the baby with us. I want to say that we waited a little bit to have this next session of the Living and Learning series. I'm Felicia Knaul, the head of the Harvard Global Equity Initiative, and with Julio Frank, Dean of the Harvard School of Public Health, and Alan Brandt, our dear friend, and Dr. Homi Bhabha, we started this series. But as I think many of you know, our wonderful first speaker, Dr. Alan Brandt, who spoke in November, if I'm not mistaking the date, did a wonderful talk where he not only shared with a hint of tremendous humor an experience of a bone marrow transplant and going through a very serious situation with cancer, but he did a tremendous job of demonstrating how one's understanding of a discipline and one's understanding of the health system can be merged into understanding one's own disease. And then only a few weeks later, literally, Dr. Brandt was diagnosed with a relapse of his cancer, as many of you know. And I was able to do something just before I came here that I hadn't been able to do since then, which was to see Alan. And he authorized me to share with you that he's very sorry he can't be here with us. He's 50 days out of a second bone marrow transplant, and very dedicated to continuing to publishing the work he did on that first talk, and to sharing this new round of experiences and what it means to him. For 100 days, I think he cannot be, after a bone marrow transplant, he can't be with the group, so he couldn't be with us in person. But he's very, very much with us, not only in spirit, but intellectually. And we'll be seeing this online, and he's just very sorry that he couldn't be here in person, Arthur particularly with you. So he asked me to share that with you. I have to say, he looks like he's many, many hundreds of days past that bone marrow transplant. He looked wonderful and seemed wonderful, and I, to be honest, didn't want to have another session until we knew how he was doing. So I am so pleased to be able to give that good news for this wonderful session today. We have with us a gentleman that I've known for many years. I don't know if he'll remember how many years I've known him for, because when I first met him, I was a lot younger and I was still only a student. And I thought, I have his bio sketch here, and I know that Homi will be sharing some very serious reflections. But there are a couple of pieces I had wanted to share with you, in addition to what it means to me to have been able to see Alan in person just before coming here. And the first is I flew in from Toronto because I had to go up caring for my own mother, who's 90. And so I, on the plane, read again Arthur's pieces for this session, what he's published in The Lancet. And I came out of those days of caring for someone at the end of her life, though she's doing very well, frankly, not feeling very up about it. It's not something that often makes you feel good. And I reread on the plane Arthur's pieces, and of course, reflected a little bit more deeply, and it made me think a little bit about mindfulness and the mindfulness we use when we eat, the mindfulness we use when we live well, the mindfulness that I think comes to us when we've had a disease like cancer that can bring us so close to death and back again. And that mindfulness, we forget about it easily when we're healthy. And Arthur's work made me think about something I will do from now on in my caretaking, which is to be mindful and try to, in fact, truly live those moments, think them through, and enjoy is not the right word, but deeply be in them and deeply appreciate them. And I reread these pieces, and I highlighted just a few of the sentences that came through as I was reading them again. And Arthur pulls away from the word resilience as it's used today quite often. And I know when I've spoken about my own cancer, I've often been told that resilience is what it is. But I think that he is right in talking about it much more as endurance, in the real way we want to think of it. He talks repeatedly about enduring the unendurable. He shares in one of those cases, and I'm sure he'll speak to us about it today, his times when he was beginning in medical school and taking care of a child, a burn victim, and saying that she endured because she had to endure in order to go on living. She withstood and kept me going as well. She taught me more in those moments than any book or clinical mentor could have done. And I was thinking that that truly summarizes the essence of what Alan, Julio, Homi, and I wanted to achieve with this seminar series. We were hoping that this seminar series and these talks would help us to reflect in ways on the work we choose to do that would help us to do it better, and perhaps in ways that we don't normally get out of a text group or a classroom session. Rather than reading a biosketch, because I don't think anyone needs a biosketch of Dr. Kleinman, I want to turn it over to Homi. And just before, I may have to leave early because my daughter took ill, and if I do, you'll excuse me if I'm not here to close. I hope I will be, and that Julio will be joining us towards the end of the talk and for the reception to be able to shake your hand and to thank you for sharing with us today. Homi.
Good evening. It's wonderful to see you all here today for really a very special series of seminars that we're doing across the FAS and the hospitals. What medicine shares with the humanities at the deepest ethical level is the care of humanity. It was neither Kant's notion of radical evil nor Hannah Arendt's banality of evil that Jean Amery experienced most acutely in the Nazi torture chamber. What convinced him that human life as we know it had come to an end there, in that harrowing place, was the absolute absence of care. Caring is a complex and contradictory labor of moral action and imagination that demands a peculiar courage, a courage to see yourself both as subject and object, patient and agent, as the one who is sick and the one who has survived, both at the same time. It is very difficult to do this, to place oneself exactly where one is not when one really needs to be in the position of the carer. It is from this double perspective of being both the patient and the agent at the same time that refuses the seductions of sentimentality at one end or the vanity of autonomy at the other. And here, in between, there emerges a kind of empathic and contingent identification with what really matters. The title of a book by Arthur Kleinman. And in Arthur's words, we go on and on and on, arriving and departing from new stations, and neither the journey nor we ourselves are quite the same. And it is by accepting this time of coming and going, this time of iteration, where we ourselves are in a transitional period, transitional in relation to those who we care for, and through them and through their suffering in a state of transition ourselves, that I think Arthur so well captures in much of his work. Caring is neither simply therapy nor theory, although it contains elements of both. It is the ability to derive the aims of human freedom, emancipation, companionship from the dark conditions of displacement, illness, poverty, and neglect. There are many kinds of caring, and there are many occasions to care. Caring is the ultimate respect for somebody's singular experience, a rapt attention to the peculiarity of the case, and a concern for the complex human interrelationships and integrations that hold together the lives of citizens individuals and communities. Now, nobody is as careful a listener to the unique voice of each case in its time and place as Arthur Kleinman. As he puts it, if I have any special research skill, it is interviewing people and being with people who have gone through hard times, not once or even twice, but over the long haul, and writing cases, narratives, and scenarios. When I read that, I thought again of our dear friend and collaborator Alan Brandt, who is now going through his trial twice, his tribulation again. If your great research skill lies in interviewing people, dear Arthur, your profound human talent lies in talking to them. Talking, as you have shown me, is the very basis of caring, although caring can also be silent. Our friendship was sealed over a first lunch where, newly acquainted, we suddenly shared our own hard times. You told me of Joan's brave battle with her unforgiving illness, and I talked of my brother, a neurologist in Bombay, racked with ALS and wrestling with life. We spoke long into the afternoon, two lost people trying to hold on to the fragments of familiar things, images, memories, stories, humor, to make narrative sense of the landscape of an everyday existence, which had quite suddenly turned strange and familiar for us at the same time. At that point, I repeated my brother's words of comfort and resignation to me. Fate, he used to say, is never cruel. It is only indifferent. And although you rather agreed, I could tell your heart was not in it. It's not that simple, you said. And from then on, our conversation took a very different turn. You talked about the act of caring, its persistent problems and its profound satisfactions, and the way in which caring somehow tamed fate, that even in a situation that was ill-fated, the act of caring was a kind of benediction, a kind of savior, a way of renewing life's commitments at the very moment at which death's shadow stretches across the landscape. Today, we have an opportunity to continue that conversation, and Felicia Knaul and I are grateful to you for initiating this conversation on caring this evening. From the minute number of you who may need an introduction to Arthur Kleinman, for the minute number of you, let me just say, other than what I've said, he also happens to be the Esther and Sidney Rabb Professor, the Department of Anthropology at Harvard, Professor of Medical Anthropology in Global Health and Social Medicine, and Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard's Medical School. He is also the Victor and William Fung Director of Harvard University's Asia Center. I mean, he carries all these fates and all these names on with him, and I'm sure he would extend a caring hand to each one of these people, alive or dead, but they all come with you like your great ancestors to bring you here to us. I love these guardians who come with you every time we mention your various distinguished chairs. He's also the author of What Really Matters, Living a Moral Life Amidst Uncertainty and Danger, 2006, Writing at the Margin, Discourse Between Anthropology and Medicine, 1995, and Rethinking Psychiatry, From Cultural Category to Personal Experience, 1988, among other books, articles, and co-authored volumes. He recently has a 2012 written article in The Lancet entitled Caregiving as Moral Experience. Arthur, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and we very much look forward to talking with you this evening. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Homi. I had a long day today. You'll forgive me. I got up at 4 o'clock. I had a meeting from 7:30 to 8:30 regarding a World Bank program on global mental health. I then went on to a conference of psychiatrists from India and China, and I could only spend 45 minutes with them, even though I was the host. I then went to a class where one of our great humanists here, Karen Thornburg, was supposed to give a lecture, but Karen got sick, and so I gave the lecture with David Jones together, and then I was picked up by a car, taken to the Mass General to give grand rounds in psychiatry at the Mass General. Came back here from my graduate seminar at 2 o'clock, and now I'm on to this. So I was wondering when I came here, how did they get me to do this? And I realized two things. One, that it was important to do this, especially because this is the third anniversary today of my wife's death. And secondly, because what I'm going to read to you from a book that I have been writing for the last few years that's meant to distill what it is I've learned about caregiving, both from my personal experience, which is what I'll talk about, read you from tonight, but also about my professional experiences as both an ethnographer and a physician. But I want to show you some images just to get you in sense, because this is all going to be about Joan. This is a picture from our wedding and as newly weds. This is Joan at the beach, the two of us together. Get another sense of Joan. This is the picture, the next picture is taken by a great Danish photographer, Torben Eskerot, who's the photographer, Joao Biel's book, Vita. Torben was the photographer for that. This is Joan with her, just before her Alzheimer's took its worst turn, sort of in the middle of Alzheimer's. And that's Joan at her death. This is her grave in Mount Auburn Cemetery. That gets us oriented. So, I arrive home from my office, tired, pondering the day's events, and anxious about what I will find. It is 5 p.m. on a splendid late spring weekday in Cambridge, 2009. The red and white peonies are in full bloom, elegant against the green leaf bushes. The sky is the deepest blue and cloudless. There's a fresh breeze and the sun is not too warm. As I enter the house, our home health aide passes me on the way out. She smiles and whispers, "Not too bad. Joan didn't ask where is Arthur more than 20 times." Joan greets me with her face lighting up and her arms extended. Misjudging where I am, her unseeing eyes look behind me. I kiss her on the cheek and take her hand, the left one where her wedding ring used to rest, before she began to pull it off and misplace it, and I, with her permission, put it in the vault in our neighborhood bank. I kiss her hand and lead her to the sunroom, where I can describe to her the state of the garden, our hidden garden, surrounded with wooden fencing and a stand of spruce trees, and containing tall pines, an ancient crabapple, and many kinds of flowers. She was a constant gardener, a planter, a weeder, a cultivator of plants and people. She made our family flower, and for nearly 4 decades she had taken care of me. Joan is blind and suffering from dementia, often agitated, but right now she seems happy, and seeing her so makes me happy. I have tasks to do: make dinner, help her eat, take her to the study so we can watch the PBS NewsHour on the TV and I can try to explain the day's news stories, perhaps go with her for a late walk around our block, help her clean up, use the toilet, change into a night dress, get ready for bed, respond to her questions and tell her what happened to me today, help her brush her teeth and get under the covers. I get into bed with her and hug her close. If it goes well, like recent nights, she will fall asleep before me, and I will slip out of bed, lock up, pay the bills, wash the dishes, check my emails, perhaps read today's newspaper or prepare for next day's class. I return to the bedroom to look at her in a kind of silent contemplation. We've been married so long, and I have been caring for her for so many years. I can read her face like a lectio divina, the ancient practice of a slow, contemplative, prayerful reading of scriptures. Slowly passing my eyes over her high cheekbones and arched brow, the sculpted nose and long, elegant neck, as if I am reading Holy Script and recognizing the presence of divinity in her gentle breathing. She is still beautiful and radiates a presence, yet looks so much older. I am so much older, I remember. There's something special here that consoles my spirit, as if I can feel fate working things out for us. But how, I wonder? It is Joan's deteriorating neurological condition, causing serious dementia, that controls her and me too. I don't let myself think too far ahead, however. I try to stay in the here and now. Many bad days have prepared me to be alert and careful, ready for the next downward spiral to descend. At least this way, I can feel as if I'm exercising some control over our lives. I run through what I need to do. When should I wake her up during the night to go to the toilet so she doesn't soil herself? When do we need to get up in the morning so that she has enough time to participate as fully as she can in a workout? And then I have to bathe and dress her. Which of her medications do I need to put out for the morning? Which clothes? Which type of breakfast? And then I look ahead to the new day's challenges. Will she awake agitated or paranoid? I am her primary caregiver, but I also need to keep my adult children, grandchildren, then 97-year-old mother, and the rest of our family and our close friends up to date about her condition, and also my condition as her caregiver. Everybody is worried. I've gotten used to routines, but periodically things worsen, and I wonder once again if I can do this. I realize that at some point I'm not going to be able to continue. And then what? I quickly change the line of my thoughts so that I can forget that fear for the moment, forget the losses and her too. Fortunately, there are many things to think about, and tired though I am, I can savor the transient calm, the tenderness, and steel myself to face yet another day in what has become such a long and troubled journey. Just one day, a good day this time, in my life as a caregiver. And now let me, since I gave you a good day, now I'll give you a bad day. We were going through a very bad few weeks. Joan was nearly constantly agitated, even after taking different psychoactive medications. Every other day she became violent, screaming, hitting out, delirious. Finally, on July 4th, 2010, I decided we needed to get away, and Joan agreed. I drove 3.5 hours to our vacation home in Mid-Coast, Maine, which we had not visited since winter. I settled Joan in a comfortable armchair, unpacked, keeping up all the time a running account of how the water looked, the color of the sky and the land, the beauty of the tall fir trees and fractured rocks. And eventually I fired up the grill. This being Independence Day, I barbecued hot dogs and hamburgers, corn on the cob, and tomatoes. In the kitchen, I heated up a pot of baked beans. As we ate on our deck, we were overlooking the deceptively calm Damariscotta River, which is in fact an estuary of the Gulf of Maine and carries the unpredictable force of the sea. Slowly, Joan began to become terribly agitated, shaking with fear, panic, and confusion. She no longer knew where she was or why I had brought her here. I had developed a sixth sense to know when she would descend into near delirium. My feelings told me I had to take her home before she broke down completely. My stomach tightened and my heart started to pound as I got ready to pack everything up and shut down the house. I kept talking to Joan to make things seem right, but they weren't right. They were terribly wrong. We got into the car. Joan started fidgeting with the door handle on her side of the car, undoing the lock. Fearing she would open the door while I was driving, I held both her hands in my lap with my right hand while I drove with my left for another 3.5 hours. When we arrived back at Cambridge, at our home, I was exhausted and at my wit's end. Joan went wild, thrashing about violently, breaking frames of family photos and several antique plates. She became acutely paranoid and told me I was a stranger who planned to hurt her. She lay on the floor, kicking and screaming. I'd done all I could, and it was not sufficient. Feeling I couldn't go on, I slumped to the floor. I had no ideas or words. Even tears wouldn't come. What's the use? What good am I? I didn't see how I could go on with the caregiving. I had reached a wall. Nothing seemed able to change the havoc and desperation that engulfed Joan, or the feeling of overwhelming failure that enervated me. When Joan, who was still on the floor, finally fell asleep, I got up and called a friend and colleague for advice. I think I'll stop at that point. This was the entry of Joan into her last months in a wonderful nursing home, actually, at Newbridge on Charles in Dedham. Now, let me reflect on this, because this is my tribute to her and in a sense, my tribute to myself in making sense of caregiving. So let me read from the next section, which is called On Caregiving. And actually, this is the title of the book that you see there. I'm at work writing this book when I hear voices at the front door. I peer out to the street and see a young adult male slumped in an electric wheelchair, the hot sun causing beads of sweat to fall from his distorted face. Behind him is an open SUV, and at either side of his chair are an elderly man and woman who hold a cup with a straw for him to sip from and wipe his face as he gags on the liquid. The heavy-set white-haired man is breathing noisily and leans on the gate for support while reassuring the younger man in the chair. Then the gray-haired woman, expelling a loud sigh, determinedly wheels the chair up to the car's rear door, and they both struggle to get their charge seated, which is not easy for them or him. It all happens quickly. In 5 minutes, they are gone. But I am left with an iconic example of caregiving, the subject of this book. Caregiving. It is simultaneously one of the most ubiquitous of practices in everyday social life, and it is also invisible. Now you see it, now you don't. It is everywhere and it is nowhere. While you are doing it, it is everything. Yet when it is not a reality for you, it is nothing. It gets lost in the mass of transient events and experiences that make life so multiple, brimming, and changing, one thing after another. And yet in our times, there is rising and fearful recognition among the aging baby boomer generation and the media which attends to their interests, that elder care is a specter that will not go away, a disturbing reality that resists denial and distraction. The brief scene of care I have just witnessed, unlike that illustrating my own experience, has nothing personally at stake for me. I'm simply observing an event. If I weren't writing this book, and if I hadn't myself had the experience of caring for a disabled loved one, it might hardly have registered in my thoughts. But that's now not how it was for the elderly couple doing the caregiving, or for the severely disabled man receiving care. For them, as for the rest of us who have been caregivers and receivers of care, each action they perform mattered because the event mattered. The relationship to their charge, probably their son, mattered because something practically important was at stake, was of central significance in their everyday life. Think of what is at stake for the care receiver. Does he get outside the house? Can he be helped to be more active in the world? Can he be assisted in the most basic of ways and not lose his dignity? Will he be injured by his caregiver, even if the latter has the best of intentions? How does he maintain a relationship where he is not overwhelmed by dependency and depressed by passive agency? What can he do to reciprocate the carer? How does he handle frustration and despair? In caregiving and in writing about it, it is all too easy for the care receiver to disappear. This is a devastating irony. I find it most helpful not to think of caregiving as an idea or a thing, or even a calling, but rather to understand it as a practice, or more accurately, a continuum of active, hands-on practices, some lasting a short time, others carried out for the long duration. It is more verb than noun. Caregiving is doing, working through specific tasks, that matter for a particular person at a particular time and place, because they are basic to sustaining life and keeping people going. Seen this way, caregiving is the lived experience of performing purposeful, concrete actions that assist others in real need, with grooming, bathing, toileting, feeding, ambulating, positioning, calming, supporting. All those and other practices, some major, many minor, when taken together, make up taking care of someone who depends on others for assistance in the daily round in order to live a life. Caregiving is getting a wheelchair-bound person in and out of a car. It is handing him a cup and making sure the straw is in his mouth, bracing him forward as he gags, wiping his face and cleaning his lips. And it is also keeping up a calm and brave patter that reassures both him and yourself that he and you can in fact do this, get it done, get through it, move on to the next task, make it through the walk, the drive, the day. And do so in such a sensitively constructive way that it becomes ordinary and not oppressive or begrudged. Hence, caregiving is a process that turns on feelings and values. It is an emotional and moral experience of enduring as much as it is a physical one. One sustains the other. We care for the disabled, for the seriously ill, for the frail elderly, and for young children, for those who need concrete assistance to get through life. We give care in order to sustain and protect those who are vulnerable and unable to do for themselves. We create care to respond to pain, to alleviate suffering, to prevent injury. And we furnish care to express concern and love. We participate in the most practical of ways in people's lives in order to help, be of use, make a difference, show our feelings and commitments. In so doing, we quite literally take care. We become thoughtful about what someone who means something to us requires. We become protective and concerned. We attend to details. We devote effort. We think ahead. We anticipate. We prepare. We worry. We live with cares. What happens matters to us because that person matters. Taking care reminds us, if we need reminding, that we live in a world filled with danger and uncertainty to which we are all potentially vulnerable, but some more readily so, some much more than us. Caregiving has to do with caring about others who are close to us, about our local worlds, but also about ourselves, really, and about those who suffer and need us, who may be strangers to us and to our local worlds. In taking care of others, we attend to ourselves and to the wider world. We literally learn to take care. Taking care makes us alert and ready in a changing reality that is often gray, not black and white. We practice on the ground between clear-cut situations and those where there are few signposts or set routines. Every development presents a new challenge. Staying focused, managing the details, trying out new strategies to cope with failures can be the difference between keeping going and troubled ineffectiveness. It is a serious business. All the acts of caregiving, minute and substantive, go to build up our relationships and our worlds. Thousands, tens of thousands, millions, billions of such acts, including our shortcomings, constitute much of what our lives are about. Without them, there would be no world that we would recognize as human. Through cares and the practices of caregiving, we cultivate and sustain that world. We become its unseen stewards, its unknown caretakers. So caregiving is often one of those things, those precious things, that money can't buy. You can purchase professional care, of course, not just by physicians, nurses, social workers, psychotherapists, physical therapists, and occupational therapists, but also by home health aides and trained assistants in nursing homes. And yet, the vast amount of caregiving is performed by friends, family, members of the social network, and people in the community. That form of care is not a service that is sold or purchased. It is a form of gift exchange, where the gift of caregiving is reciprocated by the gift of care receiving. It is the reciprocity that is at stake. Can the old couple get through the practices of the day to give the care the disabled man requires? In reply, does the young man smile, speak, or scream? How do they receive his response? How do they help each other to keep going? Nor is that reciprocity only immediate, it is also delayed, an ongoing exchange that connects parents and kids, the elderly and their adult children, husbands and wives, lifetime partners over the long term. Like a great sponge, it soaks up thousands of obligations and gifts, good and bad feelings, and when squeezed, they pour out in actions great and small. Here, caregiving offers an alternative moral model of relationships that complements and also at times contradicts the professional market model. Perhaps caregiving even makes the market tolerable. The centerpiece of that alternative model is the core moral relationship from which caregiving flows out and back in. That is what matters, the caregiving relationship. Caregiving is a provision of services, but it is also a giving of the self. The gift of giving and care is an exchange of feelings and meanings, stories and selves. That reciprocal exchange takes away something from the self, but it also enlarges the self. This caregiving self is not a single autonomous individual, but a relational self tied to another person. Caregiving is a gift, one freely and lovingly given, but it can also be a curse if reluctantly and remotely given. It can enfeeble the care receiver even more so if so. The quality of the relationship is key, yet caregiving can also revivify a dead or dying relationship. Professional, not just family relationships, can show compassion and commitment, but equally, when carried out with indifference, born of burnout and exhaustion, or simply not caring, professional, like family caregiving, can wreak harm and injury. The patient-doctor relationship, for instance, can be injurious and iatrogenic. Caregiving as a lived process is a visceral, sensory, motor. It is hands-on, a working through. It is active. We embody caregiving. We feel it in our nerve endings and in our muscles. It is in our movements, both gross and delicate. We realize caregiving as we become caregivers through carrying out the mundane practices of care. We create a habitus, a way of holding our bodies, an attitude, a turning toward, a projection of who we are and what we are about that is out in front of us, between us and those to whom we attend. Through our movements, say the deft handiwork involved in feeding or the careful hand-eye coordination needed in maneuvering someone around the kitchen table and odd chairs, or the heavy work of lifting, we craft a caregiving habitus in a very particular field, a home, the workplace, a street scene, a place simultaneously material and symbolic, a homespun space of feelings, values, memories, dreams. The interpersonal space of caregiving is alive with meanings, even when nothing is said or heard. It has a texture you can feel, a resonant tone you can hear, a visual image you can see. Because caregiving also goes on in our memories and imagination, it is within our inner life as much as it is in our outer actions, an internal and external doing. Caring haunts us. At our best, we project ourselves into our charge's circumstances, strive to understand what it's like for them, and respond as we would wish another to respond were we similarly afflicted. We create a presence in that field of meaning, seen and unseen. We become present to the care receiver and through her or him to ourselves. Presence is a form of emotional and moral immediacy. It is a filling out of our personhood, a coming alive and being vitally engaged. It is like a hand moving forward into a glove. We actualize and realize ourselves. Presence represents lives animated by meaning. It is being there for someone, existentially alive as well as practically useful. It is a way of revivifying ourselves so that we are more fully human. Care can be and is given at times mechanically and begrudgingly, but much of the time in family care and at its best in professional care, we don't just go through the motions. We make ourselves present. We move outward beyond our bodies to be with the person receiving care. We animate an interpersonal space between us. We connect. We extend ourselves to acknowledge and affirm the humanity of the person we are caring for. And in so doing, we become more present to them and to ourselves. We perform tasks which are the essence of ordinariness, yet awaken or fulfill something in ourselves which is not ordinary at all. Here, caregiving burnishes our human development. And that person who matters to us and who needs us and whom we need participates in the creation of presence, both ours and his. So that presence is more than the caregiver and more than the care receiver. It is part of the moreness that William James said defined our humanness as something vague and that goes beyond common sense caricatures and professional stereotypes. Some difficult to pin down intimate thing that identifies without naming it a quality that is special about each of us and about human beings in general. That quality of humanness comes to life in relationships and in our responsibility for them. This is why caregiving is a moral experience. Through our presence in a particular field of human meanings, we participate in something truly at stake, something that really matters. Our bodily practices enact real values. We acknowledge the person we care for as the human center of our concern, and therewith uphold their significance. We affirm their personhood. The care receiver may be paralyzed, demented, unconscious. We still can and do endorse through our actions their humanity. And if we fail to do so, which also always happens, we recognize what we have done and seek to do better for the care receiver and ourselves. We compensate and make up for inevitable failures. We redeem ourselves as caregivers. When there is nothing practically useful that can be done at the end, when hope itself is eclipsed, our presence is an act of moral solidarity, the small, thin thread of our shared humanity retied. The failures of caregiving are real and have consequences. Caregiving can provoke anxiety, anger, and unkindness. Compassion as much as energy can burn out. There are awful moments that must be acknowledged, moments of imagined violence with the impulse to hit out. There's also real violence as findings of significant abuse of children and elder abuse underline. This is the dark side of caregiving. It may lead to remorse and regret, moral sentiments, but also to more devastating guilt and paralyzing fear. It can infantilize the care receiver or lead to abandonment as the caregiver retreats to a safe and removed place or runs away. It is because of this ambiguous and shifting moral emotional sensibility that caregiving is so demanding and consequential. It is enervating, frustrating, and dispiriting at times, while at other times it is revitalizing, uplifting, and sustaining. When we give care, we make ourselves vulnerable. When we approach life by taking care of others and ourselves, we make things matter so that we need to succeed. Failure becomes both a fear and a reality with real consequences. Hence, caregiving generates anxiety and worries. It adds to our cares. It brings a purpose into life, but one that we regularly feel we may not accomplish or want. Caregiving is about effectiveness, to be sure. We must succeed in basic tasks. The infant must be fed, and the disabled elderly woman bathed. The care receiver, as well as the caregiver, is often aware of this challenge. And yet what needs to be done in caregiving is both a practical act, getting a disabled person into a car and a blind woman with dementia into bed, and a meaning-driven performance, doing it in such a way as to be present and, when possible, to confer a sense of self-worth, and to the extent that disability will allow, agency on the person cared for. Caregiving, then, is a practical and moral process that is centered in relationships, and it is among the most difficult things we do in life. When we fail at it through anger, exhaustion, ineptness, or neglect, we suffer because we have let both the care receiver and ourselves down. For this reason, it is a calling that some will not, perhaps cannot answer. Caregiving attracts some, pulls them into another's life, but also drives others away. Some possess the skills and the compassion and emotional response, others not. Some are willing to develop those skills and emotional reactions, others not. Burnout is so often associated with caregiving that many fear you can't have one without the other. The more profound question is why so many endure in spite of the demands and failures. What are the stories caregivers tell to themselves and to others to keep themselves going? Here again, it is the moral side of caregiving based in the practical reality of having to do it for someone in need who means something to us and who responds to us that points to the answer. The caregiver feels she or he must not fail because the care receiver must receive help. And the care receiver also may feel that she or he must not fail the caregiver. The intersubjectivity of the caregiving relationship must be nourished and sustained. This is one of the profound emotional burdens of caregiving. The caregiver may have to imaginatively bring to life the presence of a care receiver who is so severely compromised that he or she is otherwise unable to be present. Presence may help both endure. There are, of course, multiple ways of giving and receiving care. When we care for a healthy child, there's hope and optimism about his or her life in the future. Caring for an elderly parent at end of life is not about optimism and hope for life's future, at least of the care receiver, as much as it is about bringing life to an adequate or acceptable end. We talk of and hope for dignity and also of transcendence and peace at such times. And the caregiver, whose life moves on, needs to find a way to remake his or her future. Care for the seriously disabled, such as the young adult in the wheelchair, by his aging parents, often turns on the dread of what will happen when the caregiver can no longer be there, owing to sickness or death. But these stereotypes break down like those describing all other actual human conditions when we look at individual lives and relationships, which are so distinctive that generalization always means distortion and incompleteness. Family and personal histories, financial and social background, cultural and ethnic influences, as well as the specifics of disablement and particular disease processes loom large here. If ever there was a subject dependent on the fine details of life's context, this is it. I think I'll stop there and we can open up to what I go on to, just so you know that how this section ends, because I'm not ending with the end, is I take the film, the French film Amour, and use it as a way of talking about aspects of caregiving that were particularly related to caregiving at end of life.
Excuse me?
Years ago in another, thank you for that talk, in another lifetime, I worked at Stillman Infirmary through the AIDS crisis. There were also elderly professors and people who literally lived and died there. And I remember the nurses and some of the doctors or some of the health assistants, when there was a person with Alzheimer's, would be, shoot me if I ever get like that. In other words, a way of coping with someone's need. And back at that time, like in the 80s, there was this thing about orient an elderly person to time and place and whatever, and in the medical field. And that's a very scary thing to do to someone who has dementia. And I remember some of the nursing assistants would be kind of smarter than that and pretend to go get the person's milk off the porch if that's what they wanted or whatever. So I was contrasting this kind of medicalization of what the things with my own experience and of taking care of my elderly mother, and which was a totally different thing, which was exactly what you're describing. And I guess I would just ask you about how can we help more in helping the medical community be more respectful that even when I was in my 20s, I just knew that it was wrong to say, shoot me, because I would sometimes say back, you don't know how you're going to feel when that's you. But there's a terror of vulnerability, I think.
Well, there's an awful lot in that comes from you've been there. You know the experience. Well, because I'm a medical educator, it's a very hard thing to figure out how to shore up caregiving. I get invited every year to maybe 8 to 10 medical schools around the United States to give talks, and usually they're big talks to the entire school, and everyone at the end feels, oh, okay, we talked about caregiving, now wait, the next year we'll get somebody else to talk about it. And the sense that it's slipping away, that physicians and nurses and people who really want to be involved in caregiving because of the nature of the structures of care, the way time is organized, what they have to attend to, that they're constantly pulled away from people. And this is very, very true in the American healthcare system. And it makes us realize, since Felicia Knaul and Leah Frank are leaders in global health, this has real significance for global health that we tend not to ask the question about. So it comes to China, India, African societies, we want to ask the question beyond access. We say they need more access, but access to what? I just ran today a major meeting, or yesterday, a major meeting between Chinese and Indian psychiatrists who deplored the care that's given in both countries. And and there's so many well-meaning people in health, at every level of the health system. It's easy to paint a very dark image of even what health policy people like, but they're struggling all the time to try to figure out how can there be a space left for caregiving. And so it's very, very hard to. But fourth-year medical students in America, the first-year medical students, on the quality of the interview, the first-year medical students do much better than the fourth-year medical students. So it suggests that side by side with training medical students to be very technically effective, we're doing something that's incredibly disabling in medical schools. We're doing something that is ruining people's ability to speak to other people. And I think that's true. And so these are the kinds of things that medical educators are constantly concerned with, and we should be, because I don't think that it's a clear answer. And I go further than that, just to be provocative, and say that we're probably going to lose on this, that caregiving may over the next 50 years disappear entirely from medicine, and physicians could end up as sort of a combination of very high-level technologists and technicians and car mechanics. And in terms of what we will expect from them and ask them, I'm hoping that's not the case, but I can tell you that many medical educators feel that that's where medicine is heading. And it's not just medicine. If you look at the content of nursing practice, nursing which was so fundamental to caregiving. I have a whole section on nursing here, how important it is. Nursing also, nurses now spend so much of their time doing other things than giving care. They're in front of computers, they're filling out checklists. They're often checking machines. They literally don't have time, folks, to care. And I think that's a problem. But on the positive side, let me just say that my wife, Joan, received outstanding care in the cognitive care unit at Newbridge on the Charles, which was just phenomenal in what they were able to do in the last months of her life when she was paralyzed and dying. They were superb. And also that I couldn't have done anything you heard me describe here if it wasn't for the fact that I worked weekends and 5 to 9, 5 in the afternoon to 9 in the morning, and I had a home health aide 5 days a week who worked 9 to 5 so that I could come to Harvard and continue my work. And without that fantastic home health aide, I couldn't possibly have endured this.
Please.
Hi.
Name and
Sure. Alexandra Shields from the medical school. I'd like to return to the discussion of presence. So, having been a cancer survivor myself, I decided to do a unit of CPE and working with patients in the Brigham on a cancer pod where people are trying to make meaning of the frailty of their own life. Some will make it, some won't, and some it's an end-of-life situation. But I've been thinking a lot about presence because it seems, so I'm working alongside chaplains, and it seems that some people really have a gift for being present, being able to connect with someone on a human level and communicating a capacity to go deep emotionally, which I think the flip side is also being respectful of boundaries when a patient does not want to go there, right? It's a real sensitive antenna that very few people have, I think, is what not very few, but not everybody has. I think far fewer than those who do have it. And so I've been wondering if, and that seems to be the thing that is transformative as kind of the foundation for relationships. And I think the chaplaincy model is similar to medicine in that you're constrained by time and resources and how many patients you have to see. If you're doing, they use a rounding model. And so my question is, can presence be taught? And can it be taught outside of a personal loving relationship? And how do we inculcate that kind of value? A lot of it is personality and personal desire to either connect at that deep level or not. It's a very tricky thing, but it's been very interesting observing it. And I guess what's different about that situation than the situation you're describing is that here the care receivers are very engaged in their own struggle for meaning at that time. So they aren't passive, just receiving, but if you're going to be engaged, all will be more in a dialogue kind of framework. So I'm interested in your thoughts on presence.
Well, my experience both as in research and in caregiving myself professionally and in my own caregiving for my wife was not the same. I think everyone can engage in presence, and I think everyone does at some stage. It's what elicits it and what turns it off. And that's what I'm interested in. And there are many things that turn it off in the medical setting. And I think you were absolutely right about beginning with respect. So, you remember there was a book written some years ago by a Southern novelist who had a cord tumor and was at Duke. And he had just come out of the recovery room after the surgery, and he was lying on a gurney in the middle of the long pathway at Duke, where doctors and nurses and everyone's walking back and forth, and his neurosurgeon ran by him and said, "Oh, it was cancer," and ran on. And he wrote, I didn't expect something amazing. I wanted the decency of the postman. Okay? I thought that was a great expression, the decency of the postman. So, why was there no decency of the postman in that example? I could give you many others. But nonetheless, I think we see struggling, very often, doctors struggling to be present. We see a lot of them who work at that, nurses who work at that, who bring it forward. The image I have in my mind, I tried to give you, was of a hand slipping forward in the glove. I've always felt that way in a seminar. When you lead a seminar, you know you're engaged. But when you're sitting in a seminar and you're not sure if you're going to be called on or if you're going to speak up, you're like a hand that's relaxed in the glove. And then the moment that you step forward, you move into that glove, you're there. You know that your presence is there. All of a sudden, everything that had been latent becomes active. And I think in caregiving, you're brought into that active phase. You're literally brought into it. So there's some resistance when we don't allow the human side of it to show, and for good reasons at times, because we get hurt, because relationships are entangled, impossibly entangled, and because things happen in relationships that make us feel vulnerable, I think, very vulnerable at times. And so it's easy not to allow that presence to come forward. But my feeling is that it's there, and bringing it forward allows for a kind of an intensity of engagement, a real listening, a participation that makes us realize that in cynical times, in a world with such cold indifference, caregiving is one of the noble causes that we can give ourselves to. Actually, let me go further than that, because this is all in this book. I make the claim in the book that healthcare, caregiving is basically about goodness. It's about doing good in the world. Now that sounds unbelievably naive, especially from an academic to say that. But that, in fact, is what caregiving is about. It's about doing good in the world. And that's what medicine is about and what public health is about. And that's one reason why the market model doesn't get you there, okay? Adam Smith said this very clearly in The Wealth of Nations, that what makes the market model possible is the moral commitments. The terms he used, I think, were pity instead of compassion. We would use compassion for others, the engagement with others, the doing for others. I think that's what this is about. And you know, it's not so foreign to us in the academy, though we don't like to talk about it in these terms. And I think mentoring comes very close to a kind of caregiving. That mentoring of undergraduates and graduate students is a kind of caregiving. Of course, it's a very promising caregiving, just like the caregiving of children, because you know that these brilliant students we have are going on to something. But it's different in that regard from the feeling you have in caregiving at end of life, where you know that this is not promising for the person who has it. But anyway, I don't want to disagree with you that it's very hard, and I don't also want to deny that there are many people who are tone deaf to it, or fear it and run away from it. But I was surprised in my own professional experience of how many people search for it and do it, even in professional settings that seem so cold and remote in other ways.
Both one of the papers in particular, but what we're discussing now, it makes me reflect as a mistrained economist, mistrained by Amartya. So shall we say well-trained economist. There's a problem with how we value, I think in the truest sense of the word. And if we can't translate value into something that has an output that's productive in our standard economics, then we give it no value. One of the things we've been struggling with in our work around closing divides is, why is palliative care and pain control so completely undervalued? What's wrong with our burden of disease calculations, I would say, is that we have no measure of anything that doesn't either give you more productivity or a longer lifespan. So what we think about as being, though, intrinsically good, which is what makes the world go round, we have no way to value, and so we have no way to measure, and so we have no way to translate that into the sorts of policies that would promote this sort of caregiving. Different end of life to beginning of life as well, because that sort of caregiving has value. So how do we change that model? What's value?
I don't know how we change that model, but I'm defining caregiving around practical corporal acts. And I'm saying that these are basic to caregiving, that caregiving is not thinking about it, not imagining it, it's not valuing it, it's doing it. And then when you ask people, if you look at a book called The Caregiver by E.S. Goldman, I wrote the foreword to that, and I was very proud of what Goldman had to say about caregiving. He was a writer for The New Yorker who took care of his wife with her Alzheimer's at end of life on Cape Cod. And when he was 97, he gave a reading from this book in the Porter Square bookstore. And when asked by a young person, why did you do this? I mean, it took so much of your time and your life. Why did you do this? He said, it was there to do. I did it. It was there to do. I thought it was a great answer. It was there to do. You do it. It's in front of you. You do it. I think it's that doing. That's what I said. It's more verb than noun. It's the actual doing. It's the being there. It's the doing. It's the action. It's the bathing. It's the feeding. It's all of those acts, I think, that constitute caregiving. And I think in that sense, it's doing good. It's not doing good in terms of we know that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. It's not the good intentions. It's the actual acts that assist, that help. And so one could ask, what metaphorically is the carryover of those acts into a larger domain, into the scope of, say, policy making? And I don't know, but I think, I have a feeling that if we could think of what the equivalent of that is for a policymaker, maybe it's the imaginative act of placing herself in that setting for which policy is being developed, or something else that gives that corporality to it. That's important. I think there was
Please.
Thank you, Arthur, for this excellent talk. I'm Vicky Kosky-Krell, and I wanted to ask about...
So can you just tell us where you are? How did you get here today? Where are you affiliated? Or
So I graduated from Harvard College a couple years ago, and I'm currently working as a research assistant to Dr. Paul Farmer. And so I wanted to ask about the privileges of caregiving, sort of the privileges, or the privilege of receiving caregiving and the privilege of giving caregiving, or caregiving. And in particular, wanted to ask about folks in prison, the incarcerated population, and people who want to give care, or doctors in that system who want to give care to prisoners, but face policy issues, face barriers, etc., constraints. So I'm just wondering if you could comment upon the intersection and impact of those kinds of systems on caregiving in general, and when people encounter or are faced with situations like incarceration, what are the implications for even being able to access care?
probably very, very limited, very limited. But I'm thinking, the American prison system, we have 2 million prisoners. 1/3 of them have mental illness, serious mental illness, usually with comorbidity, with substance abuse and a mental illness. And where do they end up? What's the de facto caregiving system for them? It's the prisons. That doesn't speak very highly for the way we've organized care. I really have no answer to that. Kimberly Sue, one of our MD PhD students, is writing her PhD dissertation. We'll defend soon on that. It just shows how broken that system is.
Hi, thank you for the inspirational readings. I'm Sarah Seelig. I'm a physician at Brigham in the Division of Global Health Equity, and I'm wondering just a little more concretely how your personal experience with caregiving has influenced you with interactions with colleagues or patients, has influenced your career. Interested in the other way as well, but I think particularly how your experience caregiving in your personal life has impacted your professional life.
Fair enough. Since what I laid out, I should respond to that. Actually, the book has a whole biographical section, because what I tried to show is that I was not someone who had the personality to be necessarily be a caregiver. I was thrown out of 2 nursery schools when I was young. My mother, who's 101, almost 101, tells me, because they said he wants to do things his way. Okay. I kept that up right through the rest of life. I grew up in a very tough area of Brooklyn, and when I was 12 years old, the mafia recruiter from my area came over, mussed my hair, and said, "Kid, we got our eyes on you. You're doing great." And so I wasn't headed in the right direction. Fortunately, my family moved, and I became more engaged with surviving in an academic setting rather than on the streets, and that gave me my intellectual life. But when I got married, I didn't really know much about taking care. My wife taught me a tremendous amount over 46 years of how to take care of myself, take care of our family. I incorporated those things from her, and the book is about that, about what does it mean to take care as much as what is caregiving, because I see a continuum between cares, taking care, and caregiving. Taking care is not something that a number of us have really been properly socialized into, but becomes very important once you're a caregiver. You learn a hell of a lot about taking care. And so what impact did it have on my career? Well, it had both positive and negative effects. The overwhelmingly positive effect, it made me a more open person who I think is much easier for people to speak to. If you ask my former students, Jim Kim or Paul Farmer, what I was like when they were taking their PhDs with me, they would tell you he was a pretty tough guy, okay? Maybe overly tough. It altered who I was, made me more comfortable in myself, more comfortable in my own vulnerabilities and weaknesses. And I think it made me a better mentor, or at least a more human mentor in many ways, as well as feeling better about myself. So on that score, on the most important side, the moral side, I think I got a tremendous amount out of caregiving, and thank Joan for the privilege of it. On the other side, there were downsides for my career. My career was based in doing research outside the United States, so most of my research is in China. And during the period of time, the 10 years that Joan and I went through this, I had to restrict very severely our travels. And when we did travel, we had a couple of horrendous experiences. So about 3 years before Joan died, I was invited both to give a number of important lectures in China and to be the clever Ringo professor at the University of Leiden in Holland. And I asked Joan if she wanted to do this. And she was so desperate to help me that she said, of course you must do this. I was really hesitant. And so we flew from Boston to Los Angeles to Taipei, Taiwan to China, and through Hong Kong. And in the business class lounge at LAX, I got up to get a cup of coffee for Joan, and she got frightened when I wasn't there, and she walked into the edge of a glass table, which produced a tremendous contusion in her leg with blood all over the place and pieces of the cloth that she had run into in her wound. And I had to, with the help of people there, clean it out and get her on an airplane, which I barely did. And then for the 2 months that we were in Asia, this became an enormous problem. She had to have plastic surgery a couple of times there. But actually, my Chinese friends, most of them my former students and colleagues, told me it'd be easier for you overall here, because we'll help take care of her. And they were sensational. They were fantastic, and they did that. Amsterdam was another story. We were in Leiden, but Leiden, we decided to live in Amsterdam and go back and forth to Leiden by the train. And one time I was with Joan, and you know how the European trains, they don't quite meet the station, and so the platform is separated from the stairs, and she almost fell through. I just caught her before she fell through, which scared the hell out of me, but it didn't prepare me what was going to happen the next day, because her fear worked its way out. When she woke up the next day, it was the first time she failed to recognize me, and she had what's technically called in medicine Capgras syndrome. And she thought I was an imposter, a perfectly prepared imposter, but an imposter nonetheless, and was terribly fearful and hit me and yelled. And fortunately, our son and daughter and their families were with us in other rooms, and they came, and that she trusted them. But she wouldn't trust me for a day, for a full day. And then at the end of the day, it went away for her, and she forgot all about it. But for me, it was a devastating experience, just devastating. And it happened a couple of times more here in Cambridge as well. So, I mean, you know, I can report those things that were terrifying and troubling, and those things that were great about it. I think it strengthened our family. And we had a strong family to begin with, but it really strengthened. My kids were fantastic, my adult kids. My grandkids were amazing. Just amazing with Joan. I was astonished. And it was important in their upbringing that they had this experience, I think. Yeah.
My name is Han Ho. I'm with the School of Medicine, and I'm a psychiatrist also. So first of all, thank you for sharing this very touching love story. I was wondering, as I was hearing your story, as you were caring for your wife, have you ever considered being a psychiatrist yourself? You know, essentially, I'm guessing your wife was diagnosed with, at least one of the diagnoses was dementia with behavioral disturbance. And so being a psychiatrist yourself, would you consider it as, were there moments that you considered that identity as a burden rather than an asset?
Yeah.
And how did you handle it?
Right. That's a very good question. I would say overall, if I can say it in Chinese, 真金不怕火, real gold doesn't fear fire, okay? I think that my wife had real gold, and she went through this in a remarkable way, and I think that carried me through. So, you know, I've been at this university for 38 years, and my colleagues at the medical school wanted to do everything for me. And indeed, the diagnosis of cortical atrophy and probable Alzheimer's was made by a great neurologist at the medical school, probably earlier than any patient could have had it diagnosed, because of how hard he worked to find out what was the basis of the problem that Joan had. But the astonishing thing was, no neurologist ever asked me about a home health aide or prepared me for what the care for an Alzheimer's patient is about. And these were my friends. They wanted to do the best for me. And they see dozens and dozens of such patients. And yet their imagination, their engagement is not in what caregiving is about for people with neurodegenerative disorders. So on that side, I would say that in the diagnosis, neurologists were absolutely critical, and then after that, in the aftercare, they didn't help at all. Okay? And in terms of psychiatry, but they wanted to. That was the astonishing thing that made me feel how impoverished their experience was, and how sad to see. In the psychiatry, I made a fundamental mistake in caring for my wife, which is I did the psychiatry, and you should never do that. So I handled the meds for her, and when she, at the point that I just told you, on July 4th, 2010, the end of that episode was that one of my former students, who's an outstanding psychiatrist at HMS, and her friend, who's a great a neuropsychiatrist specializing in geriatric care, came over and said to me, "You can't continue with this. Joan is not getting good care from you technically in terms of this. She has to go into a place where we can evaluate her meds and see if we can do something differently." So I did that. I went that way. And you have all, there's no clear-cut answer in this. I remember that when we went to Newbridge, which was a great place, one of the people at Newbridge, one of the social workers, without thinking, said to me, "Oh, you brought her here too late. If you had brought her here 6 months or 9 months before, there's so many things we could have done for her." And it really made me angry because, who was she to say to me that I had brought her there too late? So you have these experiences that as a psychiatrist. I think one of the things that psychiatry has taught me is how to engage my own emotions, how to see them at least, and how to try to control them. And I think in controlling anger, that was very important because it's easy to get angry. Actually, not so much with Joan, because she was in so many ways had done so much for me, and she worked so hard as a patient to get through this, that it was really getting angry at others. You have people. There's nothing quite like a dementia to bring out that quality in your neighbors, for example, or the local community you live, in which you see people who are really fine people, and others who are terrible, who say terrible things, or walk away, or treat her as socially dead. Now, fortunately, we had some great neighbors, and not only great neighbors, but the community we live in West Cambridge, and the Huron Avenue area of shops and the like, they were fantastic in helping with Joan. Joan would come in there and sometimes get terribly upset about trivial things, like the color of a receipt. And they knew what was happening and would speak with a laugh, take her aside, do things. It was quite wonderful. They became the Cambridge Trust people, the Fresh Pond Market people. They became part of the caregiving for Maggio. They became part of our network of caregivers. When you walked in there, they weren't just treating her as if this woman's off the wall. They were trying to reorient, as were my colleagues, many of my colleagues in anthropology, because it was very important for Joan to keep going with anthropology, as was Harvard. The last year that she was here, she was already, I'd say, partially demented, but still able to do some work, and Harvard provided nursing from a nurse each day for her for the last year that we were here. It was a fantastic thing, yeah.
Hi, my name is Lucia. I'm a senior at Tufts University. I'm an anthropology major, and I'm hoping at some point in the future to go into medicine and to go to medical school. And I was just wondering that statement you made earlier about first year and fourth year residents and how they respond differently when interviewing. I was just wondering whether you have any practical suggestions or advice for someone who wants to go into medicine and wants to retain kind of the knowledge about how important caregiving should be and must be for a good physician, how to kind of hold on to that as you go through your education.
Well, I'd say work at it. If it's important to you, you will come out a caregiver, a professional caregiver. You just work at it. You realize what's happening to you in the socialization process. You work at what's at what you can do. I give a couple of stories in the book about students like you who were my students, who went on to Harvard Medical School or residency and had various experiences. So one of them, who was a brilliant undergraduate, who went to HMS and always wanted to be a caregiver. Caregiving was the centerpiece of her life in terms of her what she wanted to be. She graduated from Harvard Medical School, was in her first year residency at one of our hospitals, and she was working on one of the services. I think it was I forget which service, And she had been up most of the night, and she got to bed at about 3 o'clock in the morning and was woken about a half hour later and was told that she had to come down and put in, there was a central line that had gotten clogged and she had to work with, she had to do a few other things for patients. She got to the first patient whose central line was clogged. She cleared it, and the patient said, "Doctor, I'm having surgery in the morning. I must speak to you. I'm so frightened about what's going to happen." And she said, "Sorry, I can't do it. I don't have time. I've got things to do." And she went running down the hall and she caught herself. She caught herself. She came back and she sat for a half an hour with that patient. And because she said to herself, "This is why I went into medicine. What was I doing at this point?" Or another former student of mine who was now a practitioner in our community, who as a third-year medical student on her internal medicine elective at one of our major hospitals, went in to take a history from a patient, spent 45 minutes taking the history, came out, and the resident said to her, "You do that again, and I'll have you thrown off this service. Okay? I've got things for you to do. You cannot take 45 minutes with the patient there." She said, "But I learned all these things." "I don't give a damn what you learned," he told her. You have things to do here." But just think about what a negative exemplar that is. Well, there are a fair number of those. Now, by the way, I was a resident. That resident probably is someone who was ashamed later about what happened, but was a survivor. That's what residents are. That's why, in terms of, someone asked about practical things that can be done, I wouldn't allow, if I was in charge of medical education at Harvard Medical School or any medical school, I wouldn't allow residents within 200 yards of medical students. Okay? But they do most of the teaching to medical students because they're the cheap labor, as it were. But in fact, they're survivors. We're all survivors as residents. They're cutting corners. They're turning everything around. They provide the hidden curriculum. That's why we call, at the Harvard Medical School, the first 2 years are the preclinical years and the last 2 are the clinical years, but we call the first 2 the pre-cynical years and the last 2 the cynical years. That's how you become cynical. And,
we're very close to the end of our time, and I wanted to let Homi close. But I have to say, there are some constants that I'm already seeing across the two. For those of you who were here when Alan spoke last time, do you remember the story about the punch biopsy? And basically he was saying the same, don't let residents anywhere near, no matter how much we believe. I'll share that. And we go through the different parts of the seminar. I wanted to take a moment also to encourage you all to join us at the School of Public Health on the other side of the river next Tuesday, when my mentor, Amartya Sen, will be sharing his own experience with cancer as part of his biography when he was 18 in India. I'm sure he'll share many aspects of that and other pieces of life with cancer, but giving an equity lens to this. So going on with our seminar series, we will be speaking of his personal experience and his professional understanding of that in the guise of poverty. I have found the session we had today, as I said, not only moving, but I have learned a tremendous amount. And it will help me in the caregiving I have and want to give better from now and in the future, which is a tremendous gift, as well as all that it's contributed to the process. And I hope that we'll be able to continue, Arthur, to work with you as the mentor who understands how to do very much of what we're trying to do with this seminar. Homi, perhaps you'd like to close for us.
Arthur and Felicia, thank you very much for bringing this seminar to the Humanities Center. Arthur, I think, having heard you out, very moved, but I have to disagree with you. Caregiving is for tough guys. Guys, of course, in the American sense in which, all women somehow become guys. Let me clarify that, but I think it is for tough guys, I think from hearing you speak, and what was both so moving and so useful was the way you tagged your speech and the concepts you shared with us to events, to particular moments, recollected, moments where you stopped to reflect on why you felt able to deal with the consternation and the worry and the interruption. And I think that it's the way in which those events allow you to show the metal, to show the real metal of which you are made, as well as, of course, the empathy that you talked about. But in that moment of caregiving, I think a great strength either descends upon you, or you have to develop that great strength so that you are able, in a way, to speak the yea of life and not to become a naysayer, which so often happens. But in your narratives of caregiving, one of the things that very much impressed me, that I think informed the will that you needed to draw upon, is the actual possibility of narrative. Repeatedly you talked about the 47 years. Repeatedly you talked about past memories. Repeatedly you talked about moments of deep kindness from on Joan's part. And in those moments which to me are the most frightening, when you cannot actually verbally communicate, although you can physically communicate, with somebody like Joan, who was so much your intellectual equal, who was so much your collaborator. I know it now with my own mother who lives in India. I call her, and when I call her twice a day, I expect her to be able to give a reliable account of herself, and she cannot. And if I have to get the account from a nurse or from some other person, it has robbed me of that intimacy. If I have to, get the did you go out this afternoon? I didn't go out. And I can hear the nurse saying, no, you did. I almost wish she didn't tell me, because there's something about that, being overspoken and being overheard, which destroys the intimacy. And I feel that the way in which you talked about the memories, the way in which you used memory and narrative in your rendition today of this time made me feel that memory is an ethical agency. It's not merely about remembering, it's not merely about the past. The use of memory for an ethics of caring is the kind of retitling of your talk that I would have given, because it seems to me that the way in which you speak to yourself about the past and about the person when they can no longer quite speak to you in the way in which you were used to was a very important learning moment for me in your conversation. The other issue, I lived very close to you, and the other issue I wanted to bring up was, of course, the strength of community. And an event like this, which brings a whole range of people to our midst to hear about, at the end of the day, one person's caring, one person's grief, one person's peace, one person's distress. That's the sign of community, to be able to gather, to give both love and respect to one individual's testimony. I think that is the great sign of, and you evoked it today, and I thank you for that.